Calvary Baptist Church of Willard welcomes you to an audio recording of a Bible message from our pastor. For more information about Jesus, the Bible, or our church, please visit our website at www.calvarywillard.org. Now on to today's message from the Bible.
Our message today is taken from Mark 15, 1-20. They knew what they were doing. Whenever a criminal is brought before a judge, one of the things that has to be considered is intent. Did the criminal know what they were doing, and were they intending to do harm to the other person? There have been times when someone has accidentally harmed another person. There have also been other times when someone has willfully harmed another person. Both cases are not treated the same because the intent was different. In Mark 15, 1-20, we finally come to the account of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. As we read through the passage, we will see several groups or individuals who were involved in Jesus' death. Were each of them actively and willfully involved in his death? What was their intent? Did they know what they were doing? Keep those questions in mind as we read through the passage. Mark 15, verse 1. Immediately in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus, led him away, and delivered him to Pilate. Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered and said to him, "It is as you say." And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Then Pilate asked him again, saying, "Do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you." But Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Now at the feast he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. And there was one named Barabbas who was chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. Then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. But Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" For he knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. Pilate answered and said to them again, "What then do you want me to do with him who you call the king of the Jews?" So they cried out again, "Crucify him!" Then Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole garrison, and they clothed him with purple, and they twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they struck him on the head with a reed and spat on him, and bowing the knee they worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. As we go through this passage, let's answer our three questions. The first one is, what does it say? And here I'll put what we've read into my own words. When it was morning, the chief priests immediately held a meeting with the elders, scribes, and the entire Sanhedrin. Then they bound Jesus and led him to Pilate. He asked Jesus if he considered himself to be the king of the Jews, and Jesus answered with the words, "You say," which was, as one commentator says, a cryptic reply, literally, "You," emphatic, "say so." That is, the designation is yours. While the chief priests accused Jesus of many things, he didn't answer their accusations. Pilate asked him why he was not answering their many accusations, but Jesus remained silent. His silence amazed Pilate. During the feast, Pilate usually released a prisoner to the Jewish people, someone they would request. One of the current prisoners was a rebel named Barabbas, who was chained together with his fellow rebels. They had murdered people during the rebellion. The crowd cried out for Pilate to release a prisoner, as was his practice. He asked them if he should release the king of the Jews. He knew that the chief priests were jealous of Jesus. However, The chief priests had stirred up the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be released. So Pilate asked what he should do with the one called the King of the Jews. The crowd called for his crucifixion once again. Pilate asked what wrong Jesus had done. They didn't answer his question, but yelled louder for his crucifixion. Choosing to please the crowd, Pilate chose to release Barabbas and send Jesus to be scourged and then crucified. The soldiers led Jesus into the praetorium, where they mustered the whole garrison. They clothed Jesus in purple, put a crown of thorns on his head, and then pretended to salute him as the King of the Jews. After this, they struck Jesus on the head with a cane, spat on him, and pretended to worship him. When they were done mocking Jesus, they took off the purple robe, put his own clothes back on him, and led him away to be crucified. So we've answered the question, what does it say? Now, what does it mean? Well, the first thought is this: the religious leaders knew what they were doing. Mark tells us that the chief priests who had captured Jesus the previous evening got together with the rest of the Sanhedrin and convinced them to take Jesus to Pilate. And I'll quote a commentator here. The reason they did this was that the Sanhedrin could condemn Jesus to die, but they could not carry out the execution. Only Rome could do that. They took him to the governor so that he could prescribe the death penalty, and when they arrived, they made many accusations and incited the crowd against him. They obviously knew what they were doing. In their minds, they were eliminating an enemy. Jesus had confronted them about their wrong thoughts, words, and practices, and they had not responded well to that. From the beginning, they had wanted to kill him, and so they conspired with the other leaders to have Jesus executed. However, despite the many accusations raised against him, they didn't have a good case, and the governor recognized that they were envious against Jesus. But nothing could stop their evil plan. They kept pushing the governor and the crowd to have Jesus crucified, and they finally got their way. The religious leaders knew what they were doing, but at the same time, they didn't know what they were doing. They did not know that they were actually rejecting God who had become a man, Jesus himself. They thought they were just getting rid of a political, religious enemy. If they had known, they would have fallen to the ground and worshiped Jesus. They also did not know that they were being used to accomplish God's plan. They thought they were getting rid of their enemy, but they were actually leading Jesus to die for the sins of the world, including their own. The second thought is that Jesus knew what he was doing. When the chief priests brought their accusations against Jesus, he didn't respond. This was rare for someone who was being accused to not respond, not even to say anything. But Jesus knew what he was doing because he knew what God had planned. If you turn back to Isaiah 53, verse 7, you'll see that the prophet foretold how Jesus would respond during his affliction. It says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." He didn't open his mouth to challenge his accusers. And if you think about it, Jesus could have answered all of their accusations and won his release. But Jesus knew what he was doing. He was fulfilling this prophecy. But this brings up a question. Why did he not open his mouth? The answer is that he knew he was fulfilling God's plan. And if you look back in Isaiah 53, you'll see verses 4 through 6 that also talk about this. There the prophet says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." In these verses, we find that the Lord led the prophet to foretell what Jesus would accomplish by his death. In verse 4, he bore our griefs and sorrows and was struck by God. In verse 5, he was wounded for our transgressions so that we could be healed. And in verse 6, he died to pay for the iniquities of us all. Jesus knew what he was doing. And because of that, he was unwilling to hold back the process that God had already started. He willingly allowed himself to be falsely accused, mocked, scourged, and finally crucified. He did all of this because he knew that dying for us was the only way to accomplish God's plan, to make it possible for sinful man to be reconciled to God through his blood. Third statement. Pilate knew what he was doing. Now, who was Pilate? Well, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, he was a Roman prefect or governor of Judea from the years AD 26 to 36, while Tiberius was the emperor. One of the things he had done while he was this governor was he had hung up banners of the emperor so that people could worship the emperor, which obviously was not something that the Jewish people wanted to do. And they also distributed coins with the emperor's head on them, and the Jewish people did not like that at all. They were angered by that. Another thing that we know about Pilate is that at some point he mingled the blood of Jewish men with the blood sacrifices in Jerusalem. We don't know all the details about this story because only the Bible tells us about that, but somehow he must have killed some Jewish people and then taken their blood and mingled it with the sacrifices people were offering in the temple. One of the commentators says that we don't have that history written down somewhere, but there's a similar incident that happened before the ministry of Jesus. Pilate wanted to make an aqueduct, the thing that brings water from one place to another. Perhaps you've seen the Roman aqueducts, those big bridges with arches holding them up. So he wanted to bring water from the pools of Solomon to the city of Jerusalem. And to pay for it, he demanded that money from the temple be used. Well, this money was dedicated to God by the Jewish people. So when that money was taken, they were outraged. And so when they came to Pilate to beg for that money to be returned, Pilate sent undercover agents into the crowd with daggers, and when given the signal, they killed the people who were protesting. Now, we learn from all of this that Pilate was a cruel leader who had little sympathy for the Jewish people whom he governed. However, he was a good judge of people's character. We see that he knew that the religious leaders had brought Jesus to him because of envy. He knew that Jesus was innocent of any crime. He knew that the crowds were being stirred up by the chief priest. He also knew that it was wrong to crucify Jesus, but he did it anyway to please the crowd and to protect his own job. If he had known who Jesus was, he would have acted much differently. Now, our fourth thought, the soldiers knew what they were doing. Pilate called on his soldiers to scourge and then crucify Jesus. Who were these soldiers? They were Roman soldiers who served under Pilate as the peacekeeping force in Jerusalem. Now, as you may recall, Israel at this point had been conquered by the Roman nation, the empire. And so inside of Jerusalem, they would have a large cohort or a group of 600 men with Pilate, soldiers. They might have a legion where there was 6,000 men in it, but a cohort only had 600. And so these men were given the task of scourging and crucifying Jesus. Scourging was where they would whip his back with a piece of leather that had nails or sharp things in it that would dig into the flesh. So they were told to do that and then to crucify Jesus. When they were given these orders, they probably assumed that Jesus deserved it, not knowing who he was. Many of these soldiers had fought with Jewish revolutionaries and hated them. To them, Jesus was just another rebel needing to be destroyed. Upon hearing that Jesus considered himself the King of the Jews, they were quick to mock him and treat him cruelly. Mark tells us that they gathered the whole garrison and pretended to honor Jesus as a king. Imagine 600 men surrounding Jesus. They dressed him in purple, the color worn by leaders and royalty. They put a crown of thorns on his head, saluted him as King of the Jews, and pretended to worship him. They also struck him with a cane and spit on him, showing their detest for any Jewish person who would try to resist their rule. They knew what they were doing. They were mocking another troublemaker and removing him from the conquered population of Jerusalem. What they didn't know was that Jesus was the rightful king of not only Israel, but also the whole universe. He was not some puny revolutionary who had finally been found out. He was Almighty God, who was their creator. They would have acted differently if they had known. Now, it is interesting to note that the centurion, who was in charge of Jesus' crucifixion, later acknowledged that Jesus was more than they had thought, and we'll see that as we study further in the chapter. So we've seen, what does it mean? There were 4 individuals or groups who knew what they were doing. Now, how does this apply? I must admit that reading about Jesus' crucifixion is not an enjoyable experience. He suffered much on account of my sins and yours. However, there are several things that we can apply to our lives. While addressing the meaning of the passage, we saw that all 4 groups and individuals knew what they were doing. The religious leaders, Pilate, and the soldiers all knew what they were doing and willfully fought against God's plan. However, Jesus knew what he was doing and sought to fulfill God's plan. We can learn something from both. Here's the first thought. Don't be like those who knew better but still fought against God's plan. The religious leaders knew better but still fought against Jesus. All they could think of was getting rid of someone who had pointed out their hypocrisy. The governor Pilate knew better but caved in to the pressure of the mob. All he could think of was what was best for himself. They knew better but still fought against God's plan. Now let's make this personal. What about you? As you consider their knowledge and willful disobedience, have you been doing the same? If you've been listening to the messages from Mark for a while, you have acquired a good understanding of who Jesus is and what he did. Despite the fact that you know about him and what God's will is, are you still choosing to rebel against him? Today can be the day when that changes. Stop fighting against God. Turn from your stubborn rebellion and sin. Put your faith in Jesus and start living for him today. Our second application is be like Jesus and be willing to endure suffering as you seek to accomplish God's plan. Jesus left us an example to follow. He quietly accepted the accusations, mockery, and cruel treatment because he knew it was part of the Father's plan. In his case, God's plan was for Jesus to go through that abuse and to give his life for us so that we could be reconciled to God the Father. Now all who repent of their sins and who trust in Jesus will be saved from hell and be made right with God. But Peter gives a further application of this in his epistle. He tells us that we ought to be patient when suffering as we remember what Jesus did for us. And that's found in 1 Peter 2:20-21, which says, "For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps." Since Jesus was willing to go through that awful suffering for each of us, shouldn't we as Christians be willing to suffer patiently as God works out his plan in our own lives? Jesus told us that the world would hate us and that we should expect suffering. But when we see all of that as part of God's plan to fulfill the greater good of pointing people to Christ, us being an ambassador for Christ, and bringing God more glory, the suffering will be easier to handle. Now our conclusion. The recurring theme of these verses is that they knew what they were doing. The religious leaders, Pilate, the soldiers, and Jesus all knew what they were doing. All of them were attempting to fulfill a certain purpose. Thankfully, despite the terrible things that happened, God's ultimate purpose was fulfilled in the death of Jesus. We will see that developed further in the rest of the chapter. I hope you'll come back next time.